give us some introductory remarks.
Well, I've had a lot of thoughts throughout the day, actually, because I think things that people have said have, in various panels, have had a lot of resonance with my thinking, and in fact, even caused me to overturn some of my thinking during the course of the day, in that I think a lot of us as atheists are not necessarily militantly evangelical, because lapsing from some kind of belief and living your life without God, and in my case, I come from generations of atheists. And I think this is something I want people to bear in mind. It's actually, people have been atheists for generations in many, many parts of the world. It isn't just a Western thing. And it's precisely because they've had to break so many taboos and stand up for their beliefs, they can be passionate about it. But, they're not necessarily evangelical about it. And some of the stuff, even as we were told, in our comedy routine just now, is that fundamentalists learn questions and answers around all kinds of things, around science, technology, and so on, in order to answer people's doubts, in order to look at things like creationism, to make it seem valid, scientific, and so on. And we don't equip people with the things that we're doing. And I think it's really important, therefore, that we're talking about the hard fight it's been to get a book on atheism for youngsters written and things like that. I think it's great that that's happening. And I think we need to get out more with a sort of both a pedagogical and a popular analysis of how we can exist without belief and fight for secularism, as many people have said. But I want to talk about, take off from where Rumi left off with his very good book on multiculturalism, and talk about how that belief in multiculturalism as social policy has really infected British policy, not only at home, but also as a key part of its counterterrorism strategy and its work abroad. What we have is, through the war on terror, the normal discourse you hear is that Islamophobia has risen, racism has risen against Muslims, and therefore we must defend Muslims. And by defending Muslims, what is assumed to be is that you defend the political organizations of fundamentalists that we were talking about earlier. So you end up defending political Islam. So you get the Labour government appointing, in effect, Jamaat-e-Islami people under a number of front organizations, but particularly the Muslim Council of Britain, as their key partners. And as we see from leaks of government documents that occurred way before WikiLeaks, a very brave civil servant leaked documents which were published by Martin Bright, by inevitably a Tory think tank, because no Labour think tank would touch this, Policy Exchange, showing that the Labour government was pushing people to deal with the Muslim Council of Britain, even in the arts, the Arts Council, arts programs, and all this kind of thing. And on the other hand, you get the Stop the War Coalition with the Socialist Workers' Party as a huge part of it, the Stop the War Coalition, making a formal alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood in the form of the Muslim Association of Britain. And then you get Amnesty International, which has got into bed with people who support Al-Qaeda, and key Al-Qaeda ideologues like Anwar al-Awlaki and Ali Tamimi, and call them reasonable men. Tamimi is a man who said if you pray beside a Shia, you should cut his head off. And Muazzim Beg, the director of Caged Prisoners, says this is a reasonable, middle-of-the-path scholar. And he's considered, when asked, in effect, having to choose between a relationship with caged prisoners and keeping me on in Amnesty International as a secular women's rights advocate and their most senior anti-discrimination expert, they chose for Muazzim Beg. And I think, and affirmed their relationship with him, and having first said they didn't support his views, they only defended him because of his experience as a detainee, they ended up saying, well, actually, he does believe in a particular view, which is defensive jihad, and that's not antithetical to human rights. So they ended up actually embracing his political ideology as well, while saying that Amnesty International doesn't comment on ideology. And that's what allowed them to actually embrace this ideology. So there's been a series of somersaults, and that takes me to what Anne-Marie Waters said, that when she asked questions, she found she had no answers to those questions. And actually, that's one of the key strategies of keeping and promoting different factions of Islamists as key partners and alliances right across the left, right across government, is to actually strategically and clearly ignore and evade any evidence against them, and not to look for that evidence, not to investigate it. So to this day, for instance, within Amnesty International, even though there's been worldwide condemnation of what they did, they have not produced a single internal document or had a single discussion internally about what Cage Prisoner stands for. They've simply decided to affirm the relationship with him while projecting them as perfect victims. And that is why, with refugee law, for instance, you will get people protected for being at risk of torture, but nobody will want to point out that maybe you should use universal jurisdiction, for instance, against them. That's another plank of human rights policy, is that if somebody cannot be sent back to their own country to be tried because of risk of torture, then they can be tried for grave crimes in another country. But that element of campaigning is never used for those individuals. You simply say, they cannot be tried, therefore they have to be protected as refugees. And on the other hand, you simply do not fight to protect as refugees those who are persecuted by the very same people that you have deemed to be themselves persecuted. So you cannot see, and it's Marie-Aimée who taught me that very simple point, that somebody who has crimes perpetrated against them can also be a perpetrator themselves. And that is just something that we have to bear in mind. So I think those are some of the things that we are dealing with, which get missed out in some of the discussions, that even people who are willing to condemn multiculturalism are very unhappy about being seen to condemn somebody who may themselves have suffered grave persecution, and to take a stand on that set of issues. And yet, we cannot really look seriously at abusive counterterrorism unless we look at these forms of what I call soft counterterrorism. In other words, even if you believe that human rights is largely about holding the state to account, and I believe human rights has changed over the years and is also about holding non-state actors such as religious groups or terrorist groups to account. But even if you have the classical view of human rights that is about holding the state to account, what's remarkable is how little people have held states to account for these soft counterterrorism policies. So they've only wanted to look at the victimization element and not the element where people have actually been brought into alliances, given vast amounts of public money in order to themselves prevent terrorism. And I think, that's why earlier in the day I spoke about why people have, why we have to be wary about calling for a Muslim enlightenment. Because the reason why the Jamaat-e-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood are being allied with are precisely because governments all over the world, and this includes factions of the US, I think both US and British administrations are divided on this, but they're key think tanks, right-wing think tanks, both in America and here, which promote Islamists as a way of surveillance and control over unruly Muslim populations, whether in the West or abroad. And that is why Muslim schools have been allowed. That is why there's a huge push to move people from being Salafi jihadi, in other words, to believe in terrorism, to just being Salafis, to believe in extreme orthodoxy, extreme repression and control of women, hatred of religious minorities, and all the rest of it without planting bombs. That has been a key British government and British police strategy. And there's been really remarkably little discussion about this. And underlying all of this is deep suspicion and hatred of Muslims as people, because they cannot be full citizens and democrats. That really is the underlying assumption. And really, I think what we need to do is discuss why it is that we are such a small group still, even though there are many, many, many people, as many of you said, on the internet and across the world, who agree with these views, who regularly vote them down. When I say that I come from generations of atheists, the generations of atheists that I come from have ruled India for the last 30 years, 70 years, by democratic vote, and Bangladesh and Pakistan, where people have had the chance to reject by democratic vote fundamentalists. By and large, more often than not, they have rejected them. And yet, Western governments think that the only people who can control Muslims are other fundamentalists, It's just a choice between which ones you label moderates in order to be able to make alliances with them. Even now in Somalia, several think tanks are saying that the various strategies that the UN and the US and so on have been trying have failed. I mean, it's true, they're not doing very well, that's absolutely true. Therefore, having tried to ally with the Islamic courts, having tried to split the Islamic courts and bring one of the main people in the Islamic courts movement into the transitional government of Somalia, which is a sort of UN managed kind of process, and that having failed to bring any peace to Somalia, they must find moderate Shabab in order to bring them into the government. And as the researcher for Afghanistan in Amnesty International, who is Afghan herself and certainly not a fundamentalist, said, if they're moderate, why are they Taliban? And that's exactly what Somali women said to me. It's an oxymoron. You don't have moderate Shabab. You know, that doesn't work. And yet, at this moment, as well as organizing military action against them, there will be people who are looking to find Shabab to put into the transitional government of Somalia. At the same time, as there's been a UN-managed process that has severe punishments for, I don't have the law in front of me, so I can't remember, but I think the constitution that has been under a UN-managed process has some nods towards women's rights, but it also has penalties for apostasy in it.
Thanks, Geeta.